The Supreme Court ruled to allow the Trump administration the right to deport Venezuelan gang members under the Alien Enemies Act, but ruled that deportees are entitled to due process and notice before they are deported. Jed Rubenfeld joins us today. He's a Yale professor and constitutional scholar, and his YouTube show is called Straight Down the Middle, and the place that I always start on constitutional issues, and I want to say that you should too before running your mouth on X. Professor Rubenfeld, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, what a pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan of what you do, so thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Okay, so let's get into it. Can you explain what the Constitution ruled about the Alien Enemies Act and how it may be a win for the Trump administration, but also a win for due process and the Constitution?
That is exactly right. You just put it perfectly. It's a big win for the Trump administration because what the Supreme Court did was it overturned these orders that were being issued by Judge Boasberg down in D.C., very controversial orders in which he said, stop deporting folks under the Alien Enemies Act. You're going to lose this case. You got to stop deporting them right now. The Supreme Court basically took this case away from Boasberg and said, nope, you don't have any jurisdiction. If the case goes forward, it's got to go forward probably in Texas. So that's a big win, but it's a huge win for the Constitution and the rule of law. The two bulwarks of the rule of law are judicial review and due process. Without those things, you don't have the rule of law. And what the Supreme Court said in this case is, you know what? Here's the one thing you can't do. You cannot throw people into a car with hoods over their heads on a street in the United States and then put them on an airplane and deport them in the middle of the night to some other country without ever giving them a chance. Say, wait a minute, you got the wrong person. I'm a citizen, or I'm not a gang member, or whatever it is. In other words, the Supreme Court held each of them has a right to judicial review and to say, you got the wrong guy. I'm not a gang member. I am not a Venezuelan, whatever it is that he has to say. And that will put the government to some proof. Got to have some evidence. And that's the way it should be.
Okay, so one of the things that maybe the Trump administration could argue is that this puts Trinidad gang members on notice that we're coming for them, and that may slow up this process. Do you think that that's a valid argument, or am I just making that up? Or is it just something that we might worry about?
I think that's not a crazy thing to say at all, but that's what due process requires. You cannot, in this country, be doing things to people secretly and sending them off to some other country without ever giving them a chance to be heard. And, the rule of law has some costs. One cost is you give notice to the bad guys. In fact, we put people on trial when they commit a murder. That helps the bad guys. That helps criminals because sometimes they get off in trial, even though they're guilty. We have the proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the way the rule of law works, and there are costs to it. But it's just fundamentally important to this country and the Constitution that we keep the rule of law going here. If we lose that, we've lost something that's absolutely precious and fundamental.
Now, I watched your piece on birthright citizenship, and you do a beautiful job of describing what's subject to the laws of the land are and who they pertain to. And in this case, does this apply here? Because these are not legal citizens in many cases. So do they continue to be subject to the right to due process?
Well, you're asking a great question. And many of these deportees may not have full constitutional rights. If they entered this country illegally, if they've been here a short time, you do not acquire full American constitutional rights by coming into this country illegally. In fact, you have no constitutional rights. But the one thing you do have is a right to due process. And here's why. Because if you don't give that person that you believe is a criminal terrorist, if you don't give them due process, you don't know if you're making a mistake. Well, we've just heard that the Trump administration deported somebody by accident, total error, to El Salvador, and he's in a prison there. That's not how things work. Everybody has a chance to say, look, you got the wrong guy here. I'm not who you're saying I am. And if you don't have that, then you're not just depriving these, potential Trinidad gang members of due process. You're depriving everybody of due process, citizens, innocent people alike.
Right. And so one of the things I continue to be concerned about is when you ship them off to a Guantanamo Bay type place where the legal jurisdiction is fuzzy, we could have another situation where innocent people are in a dragnet that they can never get out of, because that is what happened under Bush and Obama. So what is the Trump administration arguing about not having jurisdiction to get these people back? Is this another sort of gitmo? It's out of our hands. Now it's not within this tidy box of the Constitution, so sorry.
Yeah, they seem to be saying that about the folks whom they've already put in a Salvadoran jail. They seem to be taking the position, look, once they're in that jail, it's out of our hands, even though we're the ones who put them there. But what this case is about, the case that was just decided yesterday by the Supreme Court, is people who are stuck in Texas, or they could even be shipped to Guantanamo, that what they would still have a right to is habeas corpus. Habeas corpus, fundamental American and Anglo-American legal protection. If the government puts somebody in custody, detains them, that person has a right to go to a court and get judicial review of whether their custody is rightful. That's what the Supreme Court last night said that these people are entitled to. It's not clear that that's going to do anything for the folks who are already in that Salvadoran prison. They might, we just don't know what's going to happen to them, and that's not good. That's not the right result, but we don't know. Habeas runs to people who are still in American custody. And what the Supreme Court said is you cannot do any more of this. You can't send a single additional person off to that Salvadoran prison without first giving them that right to habeas corpus. They get to come before a court and say, wait a minute, you got the wrong guy here. And, and that'll be true even if the government ships them all out to Guantanamo. They'll still have that right. The problem is there's a couple hundred they've already shipped off to a Salvadoran prison. And you're right, the situation there is very fuzzy.
Right. And so I also watched your piece on Mahmoud Khalil, and you take the opinion that this will fall along the party lines of whatever judge it falls before. So there'll be liberal judges who think that Mahmoud Khalil should get the right to defend himself and freedom of speech. And then there will be conservative judges who don't. And that's just kind of the way of it. And so do you think that these cases will continue to fall along, sadly, along partisan lines in this way? We know which judge leans which way.
I do. It's something that nobody should be proud of about the American legal system at the moment, that you can identify Democratic judges and Republican judges. That's not the way things are supposed to be. But let's be honest, that's what we've got a lot of. We've got a lot of partisan judging. Now, what that means is the Supreme Court's going to decide these big issues. That'll be the end of it. And right now, if I had to predict, I'll predict that the Supreme Court is not going to hold that somebody like Khalil has a First Amendment right to avoid deportation because he, let's say, advocated in favor of Hamas. If you advocate in favor of Hamas, if you were a citizen, you could not be imprisoned for that. That's a First Amendment right. First Amendment protects the most abhorrent speech. You can advocate and espouse and support the worst terrorist butchers like Hamas, and you're still protected by the First Amendment. But that does not apply to a non-citizen in a deportation proceeding. That's what I'm going to predict that the Supreme Court will hold. But as I said in that piece that you referred to, judges are going to differ about this, and nobody can be sure what the Supreme Court's going to say.
And so that must be your take then. May I extrapolate that to your take on Judge Boasberg, that his opinion was predictable, and now it's moving to the next judge, and whoever that is, we can predict because we have partisan judges.
Yeah, but I know Jeb Boasberg. He's a very good judge. And when I say that our judges' reactions tend to fall on partisan lines, that doesn't mean you can look at any particular opinion and say, well, that opinion's wrong because it was decided by a liberal judge, or that opinion's wrong because it was decided by a conservative judge. You better look at the opinion. And you can't just start saying that Boasberg was wrong just because, he tends to, have more liberal views. He's a very good judge, and the position he took about his own jurisdiction in this case was not crazy. Number of justices on the Supreme Court, liberal justices, but a number of justices upheld his jurisdiction, which he had found. It was not a crazy position. So, I don't think we can reject what a judge says just because we think that he's liberal or conservative.
Right. I thought you did a beautiful piece doing the Trump ruling on whether or not he had presidential immunity. It was not necessarily partisan. The opinions were just very well written. So I appreciate your assessment of that. Do you think that it will come to a head? Because one thing that I'm concerned about is the Trump administration continues to expand the idea of acceptable speech under the guise of anti-Semitism. And what if an American citizen speaks out against Israel and is then convicted of anti-Semitism? Do you think the Constitution is strong enough to protect those beliefs right now? And what would happen if an American citizen were actually punished under what they're doing now to critics of Israel that are not citizens?
Well, you're not asking another great question. And the answer's got to be that the Constitution has to defend and protect those people. And it has to be strong enough. We're not living in America anymore. If people can be thrown in prison for their political opinions, and again, I'll repeat it. Those opinions might be the most abhorrent things you can imagine. I think anybody who gets out there and exults, takes pleasure in October 7th, and you see people doing that, they are repulsive. Their opinions are repulsive, but they are protected by our First Amendment, and you cannot throw them in prison because of that. And I agree with you. You see some movements in this well-intentioned effort to stop anti-Semitism that are now doing to these people what was done to conservatives for the last, 4 years, punishing them for expressing conservative opinions. You cannot be punishing people for expressing opinions you don't like. That's not the American way.
Right. Well, Jed Rubenfeld, thank you so much for joining the show today. First time Redacted guest. I was really excited to talk to you. You can seek him out on X. Also, his YouTube channel is called Straight Down the Middle. And again, on these major court cases, one of the first places I go to study. So thank you for coming.
Thanks so much for having me.